Hello. In working on this project, both the presentation and the portfolio, I had started to wonder what is the difference between expansive and inclusive language? Luckily, many of the authors that I read adequately address this in their pieces. So I wanted to provide a short explanation of the difference between expansive and inclusive language and why I chose to work with expansive. So in the ELCA social statement, faith, sexism, and justice, a call to action, inclusive language is defined as the inclusion of all genders when referring to humanity or God. This seems pretty straightforward. There's an FAQ, or frequently asked questions page on the topic, and it goes on to discuss other types of inclusion as well, beyond gender. And so inviting us to be mindful of the language that we are using around things not just as gender, but also disability, race, class, economic status, all of those. Those are good things, great things to keep in mind as we work towards becoming an inclusive and welcoming space. However, for the purposes of this presentation and my portfolio, I wanted to focus specifically on the language that we use for God or higher powers or the divine. So that definition of inclusion didn't fit with where my project is going. The same social statement from the ELCA defines expansive language as language and imagery that is not limited to humanity. So, in short, it goes beyond describing the person of God to include all the metaphors that we see: God as a river, a rock, a tree, all of those. I appreciate this imagery because some of the words that we use that are person for God, such as mother, father, shepherd, teacher, um, don't fit with some people and where they're at. And they can find that to be exclusionary to them when they go to a church and they hear, oh, God is this. And that's the only definition that they get of God. And they say, well, I had a really bad parent. So, like, or parents. So, like, the idea of God as a parent is not connective to me. And I am not able to make the connection between this redeeming God and God defined as a parent. So, um, Maggie Don, the former dean of the Marquand Chapel at Yale University, writes in her piece, Naming God, Inclusive and Expansive Language, that the complete removal of gendered language can work to remove one set of power structure, for example, the patriarchy, for removing all male-centered language, and replace it with another, which doesn't draw us closer to the truth of who and what God is. Additionally, only using descriptors for God, such as creator, can reduce God to a function instead of a spirit with whom we are invited into relationship with. Expansive language invites us to use as many names and images for God as we can think of or find on our own. So we can draw on biblical texts, centuries of religious tradition, such as um, former writers like Julian of Norwich, and our own imaginations, and we can find comfort and surprise in what we come up with for who and what God is. And it just invites a full expansion, which brings me to the final point from Sister Adeline Fairbach, who says, we all know that God is spirit and as such has no sex or gender. Unfortunately, language is too limited to describe an infinite, transcendent, non-human God with whom we desire to have a personal relationship. We can only talk about God in metaphors, knowing that we will never be able to fully describe God. Thus, a landing on expansive language, inviting people to come up with their own images and names for who and what God is, or their higher power is to them.